Welcome to the debate. Today we are taking a close look at a question that impacts the daily routines, the health, and, well, the wallets of hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Are multivitamins actually worth the money?
Yeah, it's a massive question.
It really is. And to grasp the sheer magnitude of this issue, we have to look at the global footprint of the multivitamin and mineral market. Right now, over one-third of the United States population takes a daily multivitamin. That consumer habit drives a domestic market exceeding $45 billion annually. And globally, we are looking at a sector projected to reach nearly $93 billion by 2032.
Which is just a staggering amount of money for something that, honestly, most people probably don't need.
Well, that's exactly the tension that makes this topic so fascinating to me. There is this huge divergence between what consumers are doing, treating vitamin supplementation as this mandatory, daily health habit, and what the evidence-based clinical recommendations actually say. From my perspective, multivitamins act as a highly practical, evidence-based nutritional insurance policy, one that effectively bridges critical dietary gaps and offers very specific targeted clinical benefits.
And I come at it from a completely different angle. My perspective is that for the general well-nourished population, multivitamins are an unnecessary economic burden. They lack proven mortality benefits, and worse, the entire industry is complicated by massive gaps in regulation and very real risks of toxicity.
Okay, to start, I think we really need to look at the reality of the modern diet. There's this prevailing assumption that just because we live in wealthy, industrialized nations with massive grocery stores, we are perfectly nourished. But the data tells a very different story.
I mean, we're overfed, certainly.
Overfed but undernourished. If we look at the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, the NHANES data, it consistently shows that modern diets fall well short of the estimated average requirement for several key nutrients. We're talking about chronic, population-level shortfalls in vitamins A, C, D, and E, as well as crucial minerals like calcium and magnesium. Now, I completely agree that getting your nutrients from whole foods should always be the gold standard. But the pragmatic reality is that we just don't live in a perfect world. Multivitamins reliably reduce the prevalence of these specific inadequacies.
I understand the appeal of that framing. It sounds perfectly logical, right? You have a gap in your diet, you take a pill, the gap is filled. But for the average healthy adult, these pills offer exceptionally low value. If we want to know if they are actually worth the money, we have to look at the highest levels of clinical evidence. The United States Preventive Services Task Force released rigorous updates in 2022 and 2024. After exhaustively reviewing the available literature, their conclusion was unambiguous. They found that current evidence is simply insufficient to say that taking a multivitamin prevents cardiovascular disease or cancer in your average healthy adult.
But that's looking at the prevention of major catastrophic diseases. What about the undeniable baseline nutritional gaps?
The problem is how we measure who is actually taking these pills. We have to acknowledge a massive skew in the observational data, which epidemiologists call the healthy user bias.
Right.
In plain English, the people who regularly go out of their way to buy and take multivitamins are usually the exact people who least need them. They typically have higher levels of education, better incomes, and superior baseline diets compared to the general population. The person buying the $60 organic artisanal multivitamin is probably also the person doing 5 a.m. yoga and eating kale salads for lunch. They don't actually need the supplement. When the average user is spending around $510 a year on supplements, I argue that money is vastly better invested in high-quality whole foods. Fresh produce offers complex nutrient synergies that no pill in a plastic bottle can replicate.
I think it's important not to dismiss the clinical victories we actually do have, though. Even if we account for the healthy user bias in observational data, we have randomized controlled trials, the gold standard of research. For instance, the Physicians' Health Study 2 was a massive, decade-long trial. It demonstrated a statistically significant 8% reduction in total cancer incidence among men taking a daily multivitamin. When you weigh the relatively low cost of a generic daily multivitamin against an 8% drop in cancer incidence, plus the reliable elimination of those micronutrient shortfalls we discussed, the systemic value seems undeniably clear to me.
An 8% reduction in one specific trial is interesting, but we have to look at the broader consensus on mortality. If consumers are spending billions globally on a product marketed as an insurance policy for their health, we have to look at the hardest endpoint possible, which is extending life. Let's look at the pooled analyses. The Macpherson meta-analysis was a massive undertaking. We are talking about 84 different studies encompassing over 700,000 participants. The results were incredibly sobering. Regular multivitamin use showed a relative risk of 0.98 for overall mortality and 1.01 for cardiovascular disease mortality.
Let's clarify those numbers for the listeners, just so we're on the same page.
Exactly. In the realm of statistics, a relative risk score of 1.0 means there is absolutely no difference between the group taking the pill and the group taking nothing. So at 0.98 for overall mortality, this pill is doing virtually nothing to extend your life. At 1.01 for cardiovascular death, it's statistically inert. When you see those numbers hold steady across over 700,000 people, you have to conclude that as a tool for longevity, multivitamins fail to deliver. If the primary value proposition is preventing chronic disease and delaying death, they just aren't worth the money.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I will readily acknowledge the no mortality data you just cited. The evidence indeed shows that a multivitamin is not a magic shield against a heart attack. But I argue that the concept of being worth the money isn't solely and exclusively about preventing death. It's a highly reductive way to view human health and wellness. We also have to emphasize quality of life, particularly as we age.
Quality of life is important, sure, but how does a multivitamin fundamentally change it if it's not preventing the diseases that degrade our quality of life?
By protecting our cognitive function, let's look at the Cosmos trial, the cocoa supplement and multivitamin outcome study. This is recent, rigorous data. The sub-cohort findings on cognitive aging were remarkable. The data suggests that daily multivitamin supplementation provides a neuroprotective benefit, actually slowing down cognitive decline in adults over 60. Think about what that means. We are talking about preserving brain health, maintaining memory retention, and protecting executive function in our later years. That is an incredibly high return on a very small daily financial investment. If a generic multivitamin costs pennies a day and helps preserve your mind, dismissing it just because it doesn't cure heart disease is holding the supplement to an impossible standard.
Well, that entire premise assumes the pill is perfectly safe, perfectly absorbed, and perfectly benign. And honestly, human physiology tells us a completely different story.
I'm not sure I follow. The core argument for a multivitamin is grounded in basic human biology. The biochemical pathways in our bodies rely on these micronutrients to function. And as the NANHNS data shows, multivitamin use significantly drops the proportion of people falling below the required minimums for 15 out of 17 key micronutrients. It catches the inevitable dietary shortfalls of modern life. It guarantees a baseline physiological sufficiency.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are treating the human body like a passive sponge that just absorbs whatever concentrated synthetic nutrients you drop into the stomach. But that's not how pharmacology works. Let's break down what actually happens when you swallow that pill. With water-soluble vitamins like vitamin C and the B-complex vitamins, your body tightly regulates blood concentrations. When you consume a massive megadose from a pill, your body doesn't store the excess as an insurance policy. Your kidneys actively filter it out and you excrete it. You are quite literally creating very expensive urine.
Yes, the body excretes what it doesn't need of the water-soluble vitamins, but it utilizes what it does need to fill the gap first. The excretion is just the harmless byproduct of hitting the physiological ceiling.
But the waste of money is only half the problem. The other half is active harm. You can't just pee out everything. We have to highlight the dangers of fat-soluble vitamins, specifically vitamins A, D, E, and K, because your body stores these in fat tissues rather than excreting them. Taking continuous doses over time can actually become toxic. We have undeniable clinical evidence of this. Look at the retinol efficacy trial and the ATB study. They demonstrated that supplementing beta-carotene actually increased the risk of lung cancer in smokers.
Look at high-dose vitamin E. Meta-analyses have linked it to an increased risk of hemorrhagic stroke, or chronic overconsumption of vitamin A, which is known to cause severe liver damage and adverse effects on bone health, including a higher risk of fractures. This isn't just a harmless insurance policy. It's a blunt instrument that can trigger toxicity and exacerbate the exact health issues it claims to prevent.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered that it conflates two very different behaviors? I think it's crucial to separate the concept of megadosing from the use of a standard balanced multivitamin. The toxicities you are referencing, vitamin E and stroke, or massive doses of vitamin A causing liver issues, are overwhelmingly associated with high-dose single nutrient supplementation, people taking massive individual pills. That is entirely different from a standard multivitamin formulation, which is specifically designed to simply meet the baseline daily value, not exceed it by 1,000%.
Massive assumption, though. It assumes the label on the bottle accurately reflects what is actually inside the pill. And unfortunately, that brings us to the most alarming issue with this entire industry: the massive gaps in regulation and the complete lack of product integrity. This is where the whole insurance policy argument truly falls apart for me.
Ah, you're referring to the 1994 legislation.
Exactly. Under the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act of 1994, the FDA regulates supplements as food, not as drugs. This means manufacturers are not required to provide evidence of efficacy or even evidence of safety to the FDA before their product goes to market. The oversight is a black hole. In fiscal year 2024, the FDA inspected only about 5% of the known supplement manufacturing facilities. To illustrate how dangerous this is, we just need to look at the 2024 report by the Government Accountability Office. The GAO tested 12 of the best-selling prenatal vitamins. We are talking about products specifically given to our most vulnerable population to ensure fetal development. The findings were staggering. Out of those 12 products, 11 deviated significantly from their labeled nutrient amounts. One product had folic acid levels so intensely high, it posed a distinct health concern. And even worse, 50% of the tested products contained trace amounts of toxic heavy metals, like lead or cadmium.
Wait, 50% contain heavy metals?
Yes, half of the top sellers. So how can we claim that multivitamins offer systemic value? When the market is flooded with mislabeled, contaminated products, you think you're buying health, and you might actually be ingesting lead.
Okay, I will concede that the regulatory flaws you've highlighted are very real. The 1994 framework has indeed created a landscape where bad actors can thrive, and those GAO findings on heavy metals and prenatal vitamins are absolutely unacceptable. However, I argue that identifying a regulatory failure does not invalidate the biochemical utility of the multivitamin itself. It simply means consumers must be educated on how to navigate a messy market.
But how does the average consumer navigate a market where the label lies to them?
Because the solution to this regulatory gap already exists: independent, third-party testing. Organizations like NSF, USP, and Consumer Lab exist specifically to rigorously verify that the contents of a bottle exactly match the label and that the product is completely free of harmful contaminants like lead or cadmium. If a consumer looks for that USP or NSF seal, they can easily bypass the dangerous, unregulated products. Furthermore, they can completely bypass the extreme, predatory markups of those boutique or designer vitamin brands you mentioned earlier. By intentionally choosing an affordable, third-party certified generic store brand, consumers absolutely preserve the economic and clinical value of their daily supplement while entirely mitigating the risks of contamination or inaccurate dosing. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater just because the FDA is underfunded.
If we assume a perfectly pure third-party tested product that costs pennies a day, we still have to ask if it is worth those pennies for the average person. Let's look at the economics of routine supplementation for the average demographic. There was a formal 2007 cost-utility analysis evaluating multivitamin and mineral supplementation, specifically in adults over the age of 65. The study concluded that the practice was highly unlikely to be cost-effective. The group taking the supplements incurred higher daily costs, without any statistically significant improvement in quality-adjusted life years.
But again, that's just looking at broad averages.
Because we're talking about a product marketed to the broad average. I argue that the $510 average annual spend is far better allocated toward actual dietary interventions. Imagine if people spent that money improving their access to fresh produce to support something like a Mediterranean diet. Whole foods provide a complex matrix of nutrients. There is an intricate synergy of dietary fiber, phytochemicals, and antioxidants in an apple or a bowl of lentils that is physiologically impossible to isolate and encapsulate into a single synthetic pill. You simply cannot out-supplement a poor diet. For the healthy adult, the pill isn't an insurance policy. It is a costly distraction from fundamental nutritional behaviors.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Making sweeping generalizations about the average healthy adult ignores the very specific, distinct biological windows where multivitamin and mineral supplements provide undeniable, non-negotiable value. We cannot dismiss the entire category of supplementation based on the healthiest, wealthiest subset of the population. There are massive cohorts where these supplements are not just worth the money, but are essential medical interventions.
I don't disagree that clinical deficiencies require clinical interventions.
But it's a huge portion of the population. Consider pregnancy and preconception. Folic acid and iron supplementation are vital to prevent maternal anemia and catastrophic neural tube defects. Consider individuals on restrictive diets, such as vegans and vegetarians, who absolutely require B12 supplementation to prevent irreversible neurological damage, because that nutrient simply isn't present in plant foods. Furthermore, consider individuals dealing with clinical malabsorption issues. We're talking about patients with Crohn's disease, celiac disease, or the massive number of people who have undergone bariatric surgery. For these large and growing subgroups, obtaining adequate nutrition strictly from a Mediterranean diet is physiologically impossible. Their bodies can't extract the nutrients from the food. They require supplementation to maintain basic cellular function. By broadly dismissing multivitamins as a costly distraction, we risk ignoring their vital, established role in modern preventative medicine for millions of people who possess unique physiological needs.
I hear that, and to be clear, if a patient lacks intrinsic factor and literally cannot absorb B12 from food, they absolutely need a supplement. If someone has had gastric bypass surgery, their anatomy has been fundamentally altered, and supplementation is mandatory. But let's be honest about the economics here. The multivitamin industry, that nearly $93 billion behemoth we talked about, is not marketed primarily to bariatric patients or those with Crohn's disease. It is marketed to the worried well. It is sold as a daily necessity to the exact demographic that already consumes a nutrient-dense diet and has the disposable income to buy peace of mind.
I think that brings us to a really solid place to summarize where we both stand on this. I maintain my core argument. While a multivitamin is certainly not a magic pill that grants immortality and it absolutely does not negate the effects of smoking, a terrible diet, or a sedentary lifestyle, it remains a highly logical, scientifically grounded intervention. When consumers are smart, when they choose third-party certified, affordable generic formulations, multivitamins serve as a prudent, remarkably cost-effective safety net. The NAINS data confirms that real dietary shortfalls exist in the modern era, even in wealthy countries. And the clinical data, particularly the Cosmos trial, points to specific, highly valuable protections, especially regarding cognitive preservation in aging brains. For a few cents a day, securing your physiological baseline and protecting your memory seems absolutely worth the money to me.
And to summarize my stance, I remain convinced that for the general, healthy public, daily multivitamins are a misallocation of resources. They drain wallets with scientifically unsupported promises of extending life and preventing cardiovascular disease, as the massive meta-analyses clearly show. Furthermore, they expose regular consumers to a poorly regulated marketplace fraught with mislabeling, terrifying heavy metal contamination, and the very real risk of toxicity associated with fat-soluble vitamins building up in the body. True health resilience is found in the complex synergy of a food-first approach, not in a synthetic capsule.
It is a deep and complex issue, but I think it's fair to say we have found some very solid common ground today. We both explicitly agree that multivitamin and mineral supplements are absolutely necessary, high-value interventions for specific, targeted populations. Pregnant women, individuals with severe dietary restrictions like vegans, and those with clinically diagnosed malabsorption conditions truly rely on these products.
We also firmly agree that the market is heavily saturated with predatory pricing. Those expensive designer vitamins offering proprietary blends at massive markups are universally a waste of money. They are completely unsupported by any superior clinical outcomes compared to a standard third-party tested generic brand. If you are going to buy them, look for the USP or NSF seal, and don't overpay for the marketing.
Exactly. Looking toward the horizon, I think we also have to recognize how this entire field is evolving. The current paradigm of a single, standardized multivitamin for everyone is indeed a blunt instrument, but the future clearly lies in personalized nutrition. As we see the wider integration of accessible genetic testing, for example, identifying MTHFR gene mutations that directly affect how a person's body metabolizes folate, and as we get better at advanced metabolic profiling, we will soon be able to tailor precise nutrient intakes to an individual's unique biological blueprint.
I completely agree that targeted science will eventually replace the shotgun approach of the daily multivitamin. But until that personalized technology is fully validated, thoroughly regulated, and economically accessible to the average person, the debate over our current daily habits remains incredibly critical.
Indeed it does. We will end our discussion here today without declaring a definitive winner. The science surrounding supplementation is nuanced, complex, and highly individualized. We invite you, the listener, to critically examine your own dietary baselines, your lifestyle, and your unique biological needs to determine if a daily multivitamin is truly worth your money. Thank you for joining us on the debate.